Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Atomic Mass Transmissions Live. I'm John, and today I'm going to be embarking on a bit of a journey. I am getting ready for the release of the upcoming Armada releases for Armada and for the Clone Wars, and I am very excited about repainting my Republic ships. So I've started off with the Republic Fleet Starter, and I've looked at a number of different paint schemes and have finally decided on, I really like the look of the Radiant 7 that you see at the very beginning of The Phantom Menace, where Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan go in to go talk to Newt Gunray. It's like one of the very first scenes of the film. So I'm going to kind of go through the process of painting the ships and a little bit of my thought process on kind of modifying some of the paint schemes. So why don't we switch over to this other camera and we can go ahead and get started. Okay, over here we've got the two different color schemes. The one on the left is obviously the one that comes in the Fleet Starter, and the one on the right is what I am shooting for. So I really like the kind of red scheme that you see on the Radiant 7, and I've kind of opted to go for a little bit more of a kind of vermilion, I guess kind of like an orangey kind of red for the coloration. I did opt to keep a few little details on the original paint job, mostly the symbols that you see like right here up at the very front of the ship. And in order to keep those from being painted over or obscured in any sort of way, I start off by using a liquid mask. In this case, I'm using some chipping medium from Vallejo. And this is it's a useful tool to have in your painting toolbox because you can use it to apply chips to armor, things like that. But essentially what it does is it creates a mask in between your layers where as you airbrush or paint over top of them, it will allow you to add a little bit of water over top of that and then remove that away from it. So I'll go ahead and illustrate that now. So I'm going to take just a standard brush, and I'll move this fellow out of the way. And these are the areas that I want to keep. This little panel right here and this one right here. So all I need to do is take a little bit of this chipping medium. It's a clear kind of like thick fluid. And I'm just going to put a little bit of that on my brush, and then I'm going to go through here and just paint this over top of that entire panel. And it's clear, so it's a little bit difficult to see here on camera, but this will protect that layer, and then as I paint over top, and I'll be airbrushing the first couple layers here because I want to try to do this in a relatively quick fashion. You could certainly go about this with standard just brush painting. However, when you do so, you always want to make sure to keep your layers very thin and apply multiple layers over top. So I have applied a little bit of that. So now I can go ahead and load up my airbrush. And the three colors that I'm using today are, we've got Mars Orange for the very lightest highlight. This Aldebaran Red is the middle, and then the base is Deep Red, all from Scale Color, all three of these. So I'm going to start off first by just applying a airbrush coat over top of the ship first. I'm going to turn on my fan here. Hopefully it won't drown me out too much. Yeah, please let me know if you're having trouble hearing me at all, and I'll try to make some adjustments. So as I described previously, you want to use some thinner in the cup first. You want to apply some of that. Apply a little bit of that down in the bottom. And then you can apply your paint over top of that. And then you want to use your a brush to kind of mix them up. And as I've kind of stated before when I was painting the lat, by putting in the thinner first, you're preventing getting really gloopy paint down into the mechanism down below where the needle and the internal parts of the airbrush are. So this will just help out a little bit, help reduce the clogging that you might encounter, and should overall just produce a better effect. And again, you could certainly go about this with a brush. It just might take multiple coats, and this is just a bit of a faster way for me to approach this. So for painting this, I'm just going to pop this miniature off of this base. One moment. It's a two-hand job, it looks like. All right, I've done it. And this stand is pretty handy for actually holding the miniature. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just start to apply an even coat over top of the whole miniature with that deep red first, and it might require a couple coats to cover over everything that we got. And I'll try to avoid the engines in the back. However, I'm going to repaint those. Traditionally, the Consular class has a yellow engine glow, but for my fleet, I think I want to go with blue. I just kind of like the way that looks, and I think it's going to complement well alongside the red color scheme that I have. Okay, so we'll just kind of continue to move around this. And you really just want to apply this in multiple thin coats. And if you start to see it being overly shiny, you just want to move to a different area, because that means that the paint is kind of pooling up a little bit, and it's starting to kind of create some potential problems. You don't want the paint to run at all. You don't want it to kind of cake up in any spots. Just thin coats is going to be your best way forward with all this. Okay, looks like I need to add a little bit more, so I'll set that fella down. And I think I'm going to go a little bit thicker here because the coverage that I'm getting right now is a little bit too thin to actually obscure all the paint that's underneath. Alrighty. Mix this up again in the cup. There we go, that's looking better. With the underside and everything here too. And when airbrushing here, you know, I might get a little bit of paint down here on the peg, but it's thin enough that you can actually just wipe all that stuff away. You can kind of scratch it off of the peg and just keep it clear. But I kind of have a dedicated set of pegs just for this purpose, you know, just like holding ships while I paint them. So we're going to start off with this base color, and I always find that when airbrushing things, it's usually easiest if you are starting off. Oh, thanks for the heads up, Mr. Pello. If you start off with the darkest colors first, and then move your way up towards lighter colors as you proceed. Yeah, thanks. I'm kind of testing a new setup here, and it's sometimes easy to get off the mark when I'm ingrained in painting something, so appreciate the heads up. Okay, we're getting a pretty good coat here. That is looking pretty solid to me. We're going to repaint some of these areas back in the back of the ship, so I'm not too worried about the engines so much right now. And again, you know, you could definitely do this with a brush if you wanted to. This is just a faster method for me. And it might be interesting for people to see a little bit of airbrush technique. We've been covering that a little bit more on our streams here and there, but don't feel like you need to have an airbrush to do any of this stuff. It's just, we'd much rather present you with a number of different options and let you kind of choose your own path going forward based on your comfort level and the materials you have on hand. All right, that looks pretty good to me. Set that one down. And then I'm going to clean out my airbrush here. And I do that, I have a spray pot over here to the side. I can bring that on camera just to show you. So this is well, it's zoomed way in, but it's you just spray into that pot, and any excess paint that you have just sprays into there, and it doesn't release a bunch of extra thinner and stuff into the air. So handy thing to have if you're airbrushing. And then the next layer we're going to apply is going to be that Aldebaran red. And this we're going to use a little bit more selectively. We're mostly just going to focus on some of the raised areas on the miniature as much as we can, and leave some of that dark red down in the cracks and crevices. Bear with me as I wash out the airbrush. Okay. So next we're going to take some of that Aldebaran red, thinner in the cup first, then just transfer over to this. Maybe a little bit more than I needed, but we'll make do. And this red is very, very bright, very, very dominant, so I want to be kind of selective with it, because I still want to have that kind of like deeper kind of red shade that kind of goes up into an orange. It looks like, you can see a little bit of sheen up on the top there. So if you just, with a dual action airbrush, if you just push straight down, that's only going to release air, and as you pull back, it introduces paint into it. So we can just use that to kind of spray this area and dry that paint a little bit faster, because we don't really want to paint over top of it while it's still wet. It's going to do some weird stuff. Cool. Let's see if the bottom side is looking good. Yeah, got a couple areas here that we're going to just dry off, so just straight air over top of those. Looking all right. Okay, and now we can actually start to paint some of this. So whenever you change colors, it's going to take a little bit of time for it to work the new color into there, because there's still some of that remaining paint in the mechanism inside. So now we should be able to start to layer in a little bit of this red. Get on screen again here. And on the tops of each of these engines, I think is a great place to have this. It's going to be a little bit of a brighter sheen here. And then the center of each of these panels, up here on the top. And it looks like my airbrush mix is just a little bit too thick, so I'm going to add a little bit more mixture to it. And the way I could tell is that the paint was coming out a little speckled, a little kind of spattery, I suppose. So just adding a little bit more of the thinner end of the cup, and then just using my brush to thin it down a little bit more. Mix it up. All right. And if you were going to do this with just a standard brush, you could approach it with dry brushing. You could kind of layer in the different layers if you wanted to. A couple different ways that you can achieve it. So when I'm done with this, I will do a dry brush over top to pick out the very edges of some things that'll help kind of define some of the raised parts a little bit better. There we go. On camera. So kind of as I mentioned at the beginning of this is going to be a two-part series. Both Will and I are painting spaceships this week and next week. So I'll be back here next week on Wednesday. We're also switching our slots just for next week only. So I'll be back next week to paint a acclimator in this kind of scheme as well, which is something that I don't think a lot of people have seen before. So sounds good. All right, so you can kind of see now that we've got some definition there. We've got some cool fades going in, so I think that's a good foundation. Make sure to hit the bottom side of this as well. Oh, that's an interesting idea. Could repaint a Victory in Galactic Republic colors. That would be very cool. I think I'm going to start off with the Acclimator first, and then, this is just the start of a new fleet for me, so I'm sure I'll be adding a number of different ships to it, but can't wait to get my hands on a Venator. Definitely want a Pelta in there. I got all the squadrons to do. It's going to be fun. I've got some friends that are really keen on starting up some Armada games as we get out of quarantine, so this is all in preparation for good times ahead. Okay, that's looking pretty good to me. I am going to dry this off a little bit with just some straight air. Yeah, a Victory in the open circle fleet would be really cool. I do believe that this red scheme is more of a senatorial scheme, but I'd have to double check on that as opposed to the open circle. But I just like the symbol a lot. I wanted to keep that, so yeah, I'm just kind of going about this my own way, which is a fun way to start working on our new fleet, kind of customizing it a little bit. Okay, well, that is looking pretty good. You can kind of see there that we've got some modulation of tone. Okay, I'm gonna blow through some of this paint that's in my airbrush right now. Might take a little bit of time. Yeah, that's definitely what I thought. They're kind of more of the diplomatic style of ships. So maybe I'll look at Bail Organa or some of these other upgrades to go with there for a thematic element to my fleet. Okay, and last little bit, I'm just going to add a little bit of Mars orange to this, just for kind of the final little pop. And I didn't clean out my airbrush too well with this. It still has a little bit of the Aldebaran red. So this is a little bit of a mix of the red that we had previous and this orange color in together, just to kind of dull it down a little bit, because I want the straight orange to be the color that I use for my dry brush over top. Okay, go ahead and spray it through a little bit. Here on the screen. And for this, I just want like just some little indications of the orange. It's going to be pretty subtle, but I really just want to kind of keep it a little limited in my application here, just to get a little bit of pop and a little bit more variation in the tone. All right. Well, I think that is airbrushing done. So I will clean this thing out. I'll clean out my airbrush a little bit later. But in the meantime, because I'm going to be kind of doing this for another 35, 45 minutes, I'm just going to put a little bit of cleaner down in the cup. That'll just prevent some of the paint from drying inside the airbrush. All right, so now I can turn this off. Back to some regular sound. Turn off my airbrush compressor. Okay, so now at this point, as I mentioned before, what we had is we put down a little bit of that chipping medium over top to protect those symbols underneath. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to remove that. And to do it, I just use a shop towel. Another handy thing to potentially have might be a Q-tip with a good point on it. For that, I use, I got this from like a model train store. You can certainly find these in other places, but it looks something like this. There you go. It's got a little fine point, and the cotton swab on the end is really compacted, so it's like nice and taut. So it's won't leave a lot of little fibers and things like that. So what we can do is we can just use this tool or just a shop towel, dip it in some water, and you want to saturate that area where you put the chipping medium on previous. And because the layer of this paint is so thin, you're going to see that it's also going to pull a little bit off of the edge of the weapons and things, but we can just touch that up. It's not a big deal. So you just kind of wipe that away, and it will take that off and leave that underneath. And then I'm going to use this little Q-tip to get in there and get in all those cracks and crevices. And you could use anything that's got, you know, pretty much a decent point on it to just kind of wipe that stuff off and get that out of there. And I often use this technique for when I'm doing like chips on vehicles, like for Legion and things like that, where I'll start off with like a brown or like kind of a rusty undercoat, and then I'll use a sponge. I'll sponge this chipping medium over top of the edges and the corners of things where paint would chip away, and then I will airbrush it up, you know, with colors much like I did here, and then you can use a rag and a little bit of water and you can remove those chips and it will reveal the paint underneath. Handy little thing. Definitely something that I like quite a bit. Historical modelers, you know, have used hairspray and other things like that to achieve similar results, but yeah, works out pretty well. Yeah, you can totally use tape if you wanted to mask that stuff off. It's just you know, whether or not you want to. Sometimes the areas are very, very tiny, and I like the application of this mask because you can just paint it on like a brush, you know, like a regular layer of paint. And you can, if I just wanted to say preserve just that little symbol or something like that, like if you're repainting X-Wing ships and you have got like a Republic symbol on there that you want to preserve, you could just keep it nice and tight right around there. And that's kind of hard to duplicate with tape. But yeah, tape also works. Kind of whatever you want to use for the whole process. So I do have a little spot on there that I need to touch up. Right up here on the front where I kind of wiped away a little bit more of the paint. And then when we're done with this entire paint job, I think it's a good idea because, you know, airbrush layers are very thin. You want to hit it with an overcoat. You want to spray it with a spray varnish of some sort. Okay, so we'll just touch up this little area here with a bit of a mix of the paint. So I got my palette over here to the side of me, and it's got all three of the red and orange, I guess, colors that we used before to layer all this stuff up. Cool, that is looking pretty good. We're gonna hit those weapon batteries with another color altogether. So for the color scheme, I've kind of kept it pretty minimal. It's you know, it's mostly red, and just to remind everyone, this is what we're shooting for. So it's mostly reds, whites, and then for the gray, I opted to go with like a little bit more of a cooler gray. It's got a little bit more blue in it, and that is just good in terms of using a complementary color. Blue is the complement to orange, so because this is a very kind of orangey red, I kind of skewed a little bit more towards a bluish cooler gray for these weapons, just to make them pop a little bit more. Okay, so we've got that little area kind of tidied up there. The next stage here is going to be to do a very light dry brush with just straight Mars orange, and that's going to help pick out a lot of these edges. It's also going to produce a little bit more definition on some of these areas, smooth out some transitions and things, and then we can tidy that up with just like a few little selective edge highlights here and there to really get the contrast that we want. Okay, for the dry brushing process, I've got, you know, a pretty large brush here that you can see, and I've loaded up a little bit of this orange, but I really want to make sure to like move it around and get all of the excess off. Like this needs to be very hardly any paint at all on there, and that's going to kind of help us prevent some streaks and other items. So for the technique itself, you're essentially just going against the grain whenever possible, trying to hit these edges as much as you can to get those to pop a little bit with this. And if you wanted to be, you know, more careful and more deliberate with this process, you could certainly just go in and actually actively highlight and layer up all these things. But for this kind of interim step, I like to do a dry brush first because it's really quick, really easy, and it might also just bring to light some texture or some edges that I might have missed when just looking at the miniature by itself. You want to make sure to get all of these like kind of little side edges as much as you can. And again, I'm kind of going against the grain. There's ridges that go up and step up and go over, but I'm going, you know, perpendicular to the direction of the of those channels. And I think it helps to change direction pretty often as you do this. You know, you want to try to use all sides of the brush as much as you can. And I think that, you know, changing the direction as you go, again, trying to go against the grain as much as possible will produce better results in the end. It'll be a little bit more of a flat, even coverage over things. You'll also help mask some of the streaks that you might encounter a little bit. But this is something that you just want to kind of build up slowly, and it's you might even feel like you're not really doing very much, but kind of stick at it. And the more that you pass over these areas, the more and more the edges will start to pop and start to show up for you. You can kind of see that those are starting to pop out a little bit. Looking pretty good. Grab a little bit more of this orange. We definitely want to hit the bottom as well. Again, kind of going against the grain as much as we can. Cool. Sorry, I'm intently focusing on the dry brushing right now. Sorry for the silence. Sometimes you just get caught up in the technique, I suppose. I just kind of avoided them. In the end result, the engine glow that I'm going for is this kind of blue color. Kind of as I mentioned before, I think it's just a nicer complement to the scheme. You know, in the examples we saw in film, definitely has a yellow glow. But I think for all my ships, just to kind of keep them more standardized, I want to go with that blue glow. I like how it looks on my Imperial ships, and I'm going to carry it over here too. All right. So we've got a pretty good head start on all of those areas. That looks pretty solid. I think now is the time that we want to start to layer up the other colors. So to match this kind of off-white color here that the Republic ships have for their hull color, I like to use just a little bit of an off-white. I think it's White Sands is what this was called right here. Let's see, try to keep this on camera. It's got just a little bit of tan, a little bit of yellow in there. And for when you're layering up a light color like a white or an off-white or anything like that, it's very, very important that you do it very gradually. You want to thin this down. You want to do it in multiple coats. You don't want to thin it down to a wash or anything, but you want it to be so thin that it's not going to start to build up, because white is a color in particular that can get very chalky and very kind of bumpy because there's just such a high pigment count in there. There's just a lot of white pigment in the paint itself. And unless you're careful, you can kind of wind up with a finish that is a little less than desirable. So this is going to be, you know, multiple coats. I'll probably do like 2 or 3 layers over top of this to get it to where I want it to be. Oops, let me move this real quick. Okay. Thin this down a little bit. And we're just going to paint all of this whole area in here. Now I could have masked this area off as well, but the stock paint job has a red line on it, so I wanted the entire area to be white instead. So option to do that. And I'm just going to kind of move the miniature around in my hand so I can try to be as precise as possible. Just moving it and adjusting it so it kind of matches the angle of my brush and at an angle that's comfortable for me. Let's use a little bit of water. And we'll move over to this one while that dries. And you just want to kind of apply this in multiple coats, nice and thin, build them up over time, let them dry in between each one. And you'll eventually get a nice vibrant white that's nice and smooth. So I have to make some decisions when it comes to the acclimator. I'm not 100% sure how I want to go about it, but I do like this kind of like these multiple white areas kind of carried over to other spots. So I think when I get to the acclimator itself, I will mask off these areas here, and possibly like a central area here will also be white. Most of this is all going to be red, and then I'm going to use that kind of bluish gray as an accent color, maybe painting that strip. I don't know. I'll figure it out. That'll be next week's adventure. Can think about it a little bit over the weekend. Okay, back to this. So we're just going to go through and base coat all of the engine bits here in some thin layers. Next I can go through and I can start to pick out some of the grayish areas. And then once I have all these base coats down, a little bit of lining in with some thinned down wash will help kind of define some of the panel lines and some of the other areas that are in there. Here, try to get it at an angle so you can see it besides the stand. Cool. Hit all this up. And for this, I'm using a size 1 brush. It's a little bit smaller than normal. Just keeping a little bit of a better tip. It's a little bit smaller, but traditionally I'm using a size 2 brush for most everything. think that is the preferred weapon of choice for the early stages of a paint job. I'm just gonna go through there and I'm gonna wash it selectively because you know, a wash over top of the entire thing. And I've shown before like different ways to wash. So today I'm going to be using an acrylic wash as opposed to oils or anything else kind of fancy. I figured we're already doing some airbrushing and stuff, so just to keep things a little bit more accessible to people, I'm just going to use some standard wash technique, and that's just going to focus mostly on the channels and some of like the deeper areas on the miniature as I move around it. And I'm just going to use a second brush to kind of wick it away from any areas on the raised parts where I don't really like it. And for the actual wash itself, I will thin it down with a little bit of airbrush flow improver that usually helps just make it sure that it sticks down in the cracks and it kind of retreats away from the raised areas as much as we can achieve. I like to use that flow improver quite a bit in painting when I'm doing washes or trying to thin down just regular acrylic paints. Yeah, I find that the wash after the dry brush is kind of nice because it'll knock some of that dry brushing down a little bit. It'll make it a little bit more integrated, I think. You lose a little bit of the contrast, but I think in the end, it's worth it. And I typically will do the dry brush and then I'll do the wash afterwards because I think it ties things together a little bit. But you know, there's different ways you can approach it. There's a lot of different methods you can use. But in this case, yeah, I'll do the wash kind of the very end. And in previous examples, when you know, we were doing was repainting like Hera's A-wing a few weeks ago, and then Will has he was doing some Republic ships earlier this week. A big component of that is, you know, just using the second brush and being kind of speedy with it to remove some of the excess. Because I know these engines are going to be nice and bright, I'm going to go ahead and base coat these white while I got the paint on my brush. Sounds like there's somebody at my door. I bet that's a delivery. Well, I'm not going to go get it. I'm too busy. Too busy painting ships to deal with the outside world right now. Okay, we'll just let that dry a little bit. And just do another thin layer over top of here. We're probably going to need another coat after this dries. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So let's switch over and start doing some of these weapon batteries. So for that, I am using graphene gray from Scale Color. Need to get a little bit on my palette here. It looks like I've run out of some. Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's the focus on a lot of these streams. We're just trying to show people a variety of different techniques. We're not trying to be too prescriptive. There's so many different ways that you can engage with this stuff that, you know, we don't want to limit your methods and your ways of going about it. So we intentionally try to diversify the way that we approach each miniature. And then hopefully just start a conversation in the chat. There's a lot of, you know, great painters that are also just kind of hanging out with us as well. And they may not be learning a ton of stuff from here, but you know, they just like to hang out and talk to the community and lend some insight. Seen a lot of great tips. So we've got some little radar dishes. I'm going to paint those in this gray just to make those things pop out a little bit. I think that's a cool little detail. Got a turret here at the back. Turbo lasers, perhaps. Anything with turbo in it's got to be better, right? You notice that my right hand is not really moving too much. I'm mostly just spinning this thing around to match the angle, and that's just helping me keep a little bit of precision here as I go about this. Keeps my hand at a comfortable angle. I'm always like using my fingers to kind of bridge a gap between my hands. I got my elbows kind of down here on the desk. Just all little tips to try to help stabilize your painting hand a little bit. And the more you practice, the easier it gets. Of course. Okay, let me look here at my reference miniature. I've got a little bit up here at the front. And for these two, I'm going to paint them identical. Maybe down the road, I will actually paint the exact scheme of the Radiant 7. It's got some little markings up here on the front, some other stuff like that. But for these, I'm going to kind of run these in tandem, and they probably won't have titles on them, so kind of like the look of the consistency between them. But you could, add little subtle variations. Each ship could be a little bit different if you wanted to, or you could have it be all very uniform if you like. Up to you. All right, and these engines back here are also going to be this color. And when it comes to these, I'm not being too careful about it because I know that, the engine glow process and me painting in all the engine parts here is going to be a little messy, and I'm going to have to go back in and touch all this stuff up. But this is just kind of like the first coat on these engines in this gray. Up that little spot over there on the side. This gray's looking a little bit too thin. I think I have a little bit too much water on my wet palette. It's flowing on nice, but the coverage isn't as great as I'd like. Hit those up along the bottom there. So this week had a number of Armada reveals in terms of upgrade cards. There's going to be some more stuff for that next week. So kind of awaiting news about the delays that we're facing with the next Armada wave. I think currently there's one ship slated for the end of April, and more of them are probably coming in early to mid-May. But we will certainly keep you posted on social as soon as we find out and kind of get disentangled from all these shipping delays that are affecting the whole country right now. Yeah, I am using a wet palette. It's off on the side of the camera. Here, I can show it to you. Here it is, right here. Look at all those random colors I've got. But it's mostly just focusing on, like the 3 reds that I've been using, I guess the reds and the orange, and then, the other colors that I've got kind of mixed around. The wet palette is never really a very, very pretty sight. I usually don't keep it very, very tidy. The only thing you have to be careful with the wet palette is that sometimes the water will cause some of your colors to bleed together, and you're losing a little bit of consistency. So if you just space them out on the palette itself, you shouldn't have a problem. Got some little turbo laser bits. Goes up, get another coat on those. We'll go through and we'll add another little highlight on top of those too. I also see a little spot here where I messed up, so we'll go in and touch all that stuff up. So the center of each of these engines too, I decided to paint in that darker gray. And that's part of the decision making, is just like, how do you want to map out and spread out some of these colors, like compositionally? Think a little bit, of each accent color. So I've limited the palette here to being, three main colors we've got. And I think that it's kind of an important thing to think about when you're painting Armada ships in particular, because the scale, like, the ships are huge, they're so massive. And the more that you pick out lots and lots of different colors and lots of different details, it actually starts to not seem as massive, if that makes sense. It starts to feel more like an X-Wing scale ship than an Armada scale ship. So I'm kind of selective with with what details that I pick out, and I try to keep the color scheme relatively simple. I think that helps. Okay, and then on the underside, we've got some more batteries and things that you can kind of see in that one over on the side. So I'll pick all those out as well. I'm trying to decide how many consulars I want to run. Kind of a tough call. Are there any Galactic Republic players in the chat? You guys have any insights on playing the faction? I haven't really played a game with them yet, so I'm just kind of learning them. I'm very accustomed to Rebel and Imperial strategy, so this is my first foray into the Clone Wars. I like the look of a lot of the upgrades, though. There's a lot of really cool stuff. Something I love about Armada is that, all these, there's just so many combinations of different things that you can do. Gunslinger 202. Some of my paints have a glossy sheen after applying them from the wet palette, once they've been on the palette for a couple of days. What brand of paints are you using? I wonder if that might have an effect. I mostly stick to Scale Color and Vallejo for most of my painting, but I use other paints too. I generally have not had that problem, but Scale Color paints in particular are very, very matte. They're very flat color, and that is, very advantageous in certain circumstances and a little challenging in others. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to blend things together, I've found, but the finish looks great. Okay. Yeah, I've not used those paints before. It might have something to do with them. We can maybe do an experiment with a couple different brands and see if it's specific to that. I mean, I'll typically use like the same paints over a weekend, like if I'm doing, I'm painting multiple days. And I just put the cap, or there's like a lid that goes on top of my wet palette that keeps everything from drying out. Okay, am I missing? Oh yeah, I've got these little bars here on the side. I decided to paint those in this gray as well, just for a little bit of contrast and to kind of block in that little symbol. So out of all the stuff that we've shown off recently for Armada Wave 10, what has you most excited? I'm thinking about separatist stuff now too, because I really like the Recusant in particular. Oh, okay. So a wet palette it's really pretty simple. It consists of a sponge underneath. So this is just this is a pre-made one, but you could buy any sort of sponge. So it's a sponge underneath. You put water over top of it, and over top of that, there's specialized papers and things that you can use, but I typically just use baking parchment that you can just get from the grocery store. And then you wet the sponge underneath, and then you just put the baking parchment over top of it, and it soaks up water from underneath, but not so much that it's going to really thin down your paints. It just keeps them from drying out, and that's largely it. It's not too terribly complicated, but yeah, it's one of those kind of painting mysteries for some people, for sure. I think they're great because you can just kind of keep paint mixes and things like that live for longer. If you're painting for a long session, you're going to use less paint, less of it's going to dry out. It's handy for doing blends, and you're going to you can set up multiple colors next to one another and kind of pull them together to get a full gradient from one color to the next. They're very useful. I highly recommend, you try them out if you're thinking about it. And you can definitely make them out of just household materials, just like a household sponge and a Tupperware container and stuff, and some baking parchment. You don't have to buy a fancy one from a store or anything. There's some tutorials online. If you just look up, make your own wet palette, I'm sure you can find some good pointers. All right. That is most everything. I think a couple little bits here and there. So we're probably about ready to start shifting over to doing the engine glow here, and a couple little edge highlights to pick out some further details. I do notice that I messed up a little bit on my dry brushing there, and I got a little bit of red right here. So I'm going to try to use a little bit of water to see if I can just remove that. And it looks like a little bit of abrasion, a little bit of water can probably clean it up. If I really need to, I can always kind of tidy that up with some paint around the outside, but that looks okay. That's not so bad. Okay, let's make sure that we get all these little details underneath. I think I got most of them. Ah, I see one. So in the center of each of these engines, I decided to put a little bit of this gray as well. In the center of each one of these. Well, we're releasing some more information about those upcoming releases, but you know, as everything has been delayed so much, we have not announced anything new beyond the upcoming releases for Armada yet. I'm just anxious to get some Venators in my hands. That looks like it's going to be a really fun ship to repaint. There's lots of great detail all over there. Lots of different directions you could go with it. Okay, so for the highlight next, I'm just going to add a little bit of white into that previous gray color that I had. And for this, I'm just going to use the side of my brush as much as I can. And just pick out these barrels. All we need is just like a little dot here and there, just to make them pop out a little bit more. A little bit there, a little bit here on the top. Yeah, carrier Venators look sweet. Squadrons are like one of my favorite things about Armada. I'm a big fan. And that's going to be another adventure, is going through and repainting all that stuff too. Or I guess just painting the squadrons in general. I'm not sure which ones I'm going to start off with. I have to make some lists and try to figure out a game plan and prioritize accordingly on which ones I want to paint first. Again, I'm trying to use the edge of my brush as much. I'm not going at the point so much. I'm going past it, and I'm just using the side of it. And I'm just letting the actual raised surface of these details do a lot of the work for me. Might as well just put a little edge highlight here on these. I'm going to put one on there eventually. I'll probably have to repaint this as I do the engine glow, but that's fine. And use the side of the brush here to pick out the little front of that radar dish at the front. And flip these over and do the bottom side. Yeah. Going by pretty quick. Now this ship is quite a bit smaller than the Acclimator. I'll probably be a little bit under the gun next week, but I'll try to get it all done in an hour. That's what we strive to do whenever we can. And I think I need just a little bit of a better coat up here in these little details. That looks a little bit too thin to me, so I'm gonna need some more of that gray. Well, the Razor Crest we did announce for X-Wing. That's going to be, we had a little bit of a teaser image during the mini extravaganza. Oops, the wrong one. So yes, the Razor Crest is definitely coming to X-Wing. We'll have more news about that in the future. We've got another streaming event planned in September, I think, currently. So I imagine there'll probably be some news there. A lot of cool stuff in that wave. We're super excited to show all that off. All right, get in there and get at that. Just touching up a little bit of, you know, some of these gray areas. Cool, making good progress here. Let's go ahead and do an engine here. I've got about 12 minutes left, it looks like. And for this, I'm going to do a little bit of wet blending. So that is essentially just applying a bunch of paint in there and then applying another color of paint. And then while they're still wet, letting them kind of blend together. So for this engine glow color, I am using Adriatic Blue from Scale Color. It's a nice kind of cyan-y kind of color. And I'm going to do each of these engines one at a time because it's going to be important that the paint is still wet while I do it. So we start off first with just hitting the whole thing with this blue color because that's going to go all the way to the edges. And then next I'm going to wash off my brush. I'm going to go in with a little bit of just straight white and I'm going to dab it right here in the center of this. And then I'm going to use my brush to kind of feather it out and pull it kind of out towards the edges of the engine. It'll be built up in kind of multiple layers. And then for the very final version, or I'm sorry, the very final highlight here, I'll wait until this dries and then I'll go back in with a little bit of white and just pick it out just a little bit more. Just to really kind of get that kind of glow effect going. Let's move over to this one. This up. And I'm not thinning down this paint very much. I don't want it to be super thin. I think it usually works out a little bit better and gets you better coverage if you kind of leave it undiluted. That's a word, right? Undiluted, not diluted. You know what I mean. All right. I'm jumping the gun a little bit and moving on to the next one just while I have the paint on my brush. Wash it off, take a little bit of white, dot it in the center here. And these engines are massive, like they're really big, so this technique is very easy. It's harder to do this on X-Wing ships, but Will actually did a good job of it in his stream earlier this week. Ooh, that's a little beyond what I wanted. So I'll just go back in here with a little bit of that blue. And it goes both ways. You know, you can kind of go back in and start with the blue and work it back into the white. Kind of just go back and forth until you get a pretty good transition. And it might require a couple passes. But this is essentially it. You're just, you're using your brush to kind of push the two colors of paint together so they start to make a good transition. And as it dries, it's going to start to, the division line will become a little bit more readily apparent. Okay, I'll come back and I'll touch these engines up a little bit, but while that's drying, I'm going to start to go ahead and line in some of these areas with a wash. And for that, I'm just using a black ink from Scale Color. And I'm going to mix in about an even amount of airbrush flow improver, just from Vallejo. And this is kind of handy, because it's so thin and so runny, it's kind of handy if you have a palette that has like a little well in it. Oops. Something like this. My terribly messy palette, but haven't gone through and cleaned it yet. So yeah, if you can mix all that stuff up in one of these wells and it'll kind of keep it in place a little bit better. So again, about 50-50 mix. This is it's gonna dilute it a little bit more. It's gonna help it flow into those cracks a little bit better. Overall, it's just nice, I think, in terms of like cleanup and just trying to keep it off the raised area so you don't really tint a lot of the rest of the miniature very much. And for this, it's mostly just going through here and then just trying to paint in along each of these little channels, these little channel lines. And any areas where like parts come together like this, where you'd have like a deeper recess, I think putting a little dot of it in there is really good too. But we mostly want this to just stay down in these cracks as much as we can. And if it gets a little bit too much on the raised areas, you can always go back in with the second brush. And I think it's handy to have another one of those nearby, which I do. And then you can kind of pull that away from any spots, any raised areas where you don't really want it to live. Ooh, that is a lot of extra wash there. So in this case, that's way more than I want. So I'm gonna use my brush here to just pull this across the miniature a little bit more. And just try to keep it down in those recesses as much as I can. If you just a slightly damp brush here will help. And you can just kind of pull this away from those raised parts. And I just keep that nearby. I think Dallas and Will actually like hold it in their mouth, but I have a hard time doing that and talking. So I just got it sitting here next to me. And then I just kind of like paint over each of like these little lines here that are in the back. I'll just paint right over top of that and hope that the shade just kind of stays hugged up against those panel lines. That's the other reason why we opted to go with an airbrush here, because it just puts on a very thin layer of paint and it will help keep those panel lines from getting clogged with primer and multiple layers. But yeah, you can just totally airbrush right over top of the existing miniature that you get right out of the package. What I do recommend, because as I mentioned before, once you're done with all this, to apply a spray varnish over top. And each of these weapon turrets and things, they're mostly going to be this. I'm just going to paint over top of all those because I don't mind if those get a little bit darker. But I don't really want to skew any of the red here into being a lot darker than I want it to be. I'm just trying to be careful about this, be kind of deliberate. And just be aware of where it's going. Then as a final little stage, I'll just apply some little edge highlights just to make some of these edges really pop. Yeah, normally I will just paint right over top of the miniature. I don't really have too much of an issue. Now they do use an oil wash at the factory, and sometimes that can affect how the paint lays down over top. If you are in doubt, you can always just hit it with a layer of spray varnish first before you go and start airbrushing or layering in your paints over top of it. But as always, you just got to keep it really thin, because the more layers of paint you put over top, the more the detail is going to start to get obscured, and the harder it is going to be to chase in and do some of these little lining in exercises to get the definition you want. Got a little bit too much here, so I'm just going to use that brush and just kind of wick some of that away from some spots. Need a little bit of a shade. Yeah, I think probably just washing them with a little bit of dish soap, that would totally work. It's kind of a general good practice, I think. Just washing off the miniatures, because as they come from the factory, sometimes there's a little bit of a residual mold release or other things like that are on them. Just kind of carefully paint in all those little spots. This area, I was not paying very much attention, and it kind of dried in a way that I didn't want it to. You can kind of see that it's a little bit, it's got a little bit too much of a grayish kind of tint over top of it. So I will just mix up a little bit of that whole color paint and just touch that area up a little bit. Just so we just have a nice little thin line in there. I'll do a little bit over on this side too. Alternatively, you could also, try to use oils over top of that. And the main benefit of oils is that you can use mineral spirits to kind of wipe away all this stuff. Like once it dries, you can go back in and take a brush with a little bit of mineral spirits, and you can wipe away all this stuff from the raised areas, and it will not eat away at the acrylic paint that's underneath. If you're looking for some insight on that technique, you can check out the lat video or the Hera A-Wing repaint video that I did previously. In terms of this underside here, I'm not too worried about just applying a wash over top of all this, because you're not going to see it very well. And it's going to, actively be a little bit darker underneath anyway. So I'm just going to go ahead and just paint a wash over here just so we can kind of see the contrast between the two and how they both look. Down in there. The wash certainly does a lot of work, and as far as like picking out a lot of these details, it's one of the most dramatic techniques. Washing and dry brushing is always what I recommend people learn first. This is just a great way to use the texture of the miniature to your advantage. Yeah, I could definitely utilize a purple wash or even a red, kind of a crimson color. I've opted for this because there might be some Armada ships that I choose not to repaint, and having black in the recesses makes it look a little bit more consistent with the factory miniatures. Yeah, I just kind of like how that looks. It gives me a lot of pop. All right, that's looking pretty good. So I don't have very much more. So while the wash is drying out here, before we go through, and this is something that I always try to do, is like, you know, while something else is drying, move around to another part of the miniature and just keep bouncing back and forth, letting the paint dry and just, you know, still keeping your efficiency up, but allowing the paint to dry enough that, you know, you're going to get a good finish. So I got some areas here on these engines that I want to pop out a little bit more because I can still see a little bit of that red paint popping through. Tidy those spots up. And that, I'm just going to go a couple minutes over today just to show you these last little edge highlights here, and then I think we're going to call this one finished. Again, I'm going to use just the edge of the brush here. Oops, a little heavy. And this is just straight Mars orange. And I'm mostly just focusing just on little selective areas where, you know, this is just a little bit, you know, on the most prominent raised parts, you know, like on the edges here, a little bit here. I don't have to worry about hitting every little panel here. We just want to add just a little bit more contrast, and I think that looks good over here too on this side. See one little area that I want to touch up. There's just a little spot here where my engine color went a little askew. All right. Well, I think that is a pretty good end result. It looks pretty consistent with the one that I painted previously. I think they're going to look great on the tabletop together. And there we have it. The first of hopefully many repainted Republic ships in this color scheme. All right, well, that is going to wrap up today's stream. Thank you all so much for joining me. I had a blast doing it. I always have a great time doing this sort of content for you all. So just as a reminder, we're going to be streaming again next week. I believe next Tuesday, Will's going to be painting the Scarlet Witch. I'm going to be back here next Wednesday painting the Acclimator. So Will and I have kind of flip-flopped slots as we normally do. Thursday, I think Dallas is painting Mr. Sinister, and then on Friday, Will is going to paint some more X-Wing ships in the cool scheme that he started this week. So thanks again, everyone, for joining me. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care.